welcome everyone. Okay, forgot, I'm too short for this chair. So for this class, I don't know how many of you are aware that Russia played a big role during the Civil War, and actually Tsar Alexander II sent his navy on both the east and west coastlines to defend Lincoln's Union, because Britain and France were thinking of intervening for the Confederate independence. But you know, enough people are aware of this, but I think that not enough people ask the question, why did Russia do this? So this class is going to go into that. Does someone want to read the James Fenimore Cooper quote?
Whenever the government of the United States shall break up, it will probably be in consequence of a false direction, having been given to public opinion. This is weak point of our defenses and the part to which the enemies of system will direct all their attacks. Opinions can also be perverted as to cause the false of seem true. The false to seem true. The enemy, a friend, and the friend, an enemy. The best interests of the nation to appear insignificant and trifles of moment. In a world, the right, the wrong, and the wrong, the right. In a country where opinion has sway, to seize upon it is to seize upon power. As it is a rule of humanity that the upright and well-intentioned are comparatively passive, while the designing, dishonest, and selfish are the most untiring in their efforts. The danger of public opinions getting a false direction is fourfold, since few men think for themselves.
Good job.
So this is a very prophetic quote for many reasons, one of them being the situation that's going on in the United States today, which I think we would agree is likened to a second civil war, but also this question of the opinion being so perverted that the false may seem true, the enemy a friend, the friend an enemy, which is exactly what's going on between the United States and Russia today, for they are in fact the best of friends. I think it is evident, right, I already went through that, so some might be wondering, is it really so bad that the US could possibly collapse? After all, isn't it acting like the worst of empires? Isn't it wreaking havoc on the world today? What better outcome then that it collapses internally and spare the world from further wars? It is true that the US is presently acting more like a terrible empire than a republic based on liberty and freedom. It may even be the case that the world is spared for a time from further war and tyranny if the US were to collapse. However, this is unlikely, and it most certainly would be only temporary, since it is not the US that is the source of this monstrosity, but rather it is presently simply its instrument, which I'll go over further in this class. Thus, if the US is encouraged to collapse, the bigger loss will be what the American system first set into motion into the world in opposition to systems of empire. Though at this time, this opposition to empire from the US has been buried deep, it is still not too late to revive its original spirit. If the US were to collapse today, it would descend into anarchy and would set the world even further back from the goal of attaining peace among sovereign nation states. It is thus in the best interest of everyone that the US is supported in returning to its true republican roots, rather than watching it burn from a distance, for it is only through a functional US that the true root of empire and tyrannical oligarchism can be defeated. So, this is a picture of Leibniz, Tsar Peter the Great. For those who are not aware of who Gottfried Leibniz is, he at the time, there wasn't really a concept of science per se or a profession of science, if you can believe it, and it was more considered natural philosophy. You know, you got your grants from a king or a well-to-do patron.
What time period?
I have the date at the bottom of my notes. He was 1646 to 1716. Peter the Great is 1672 to 1725. So Leibniz was at the forefront of not only creating an actual structure for the sciences in general, he also invented the calculus, or discovered the calculus, but he was also shaping the concept of science in its role within political economy, that they weren't separated. And so he was organizing all across Europe with these ideas, and Peter the Great was probably the most influential person that completely adopted Leibniz as his student. Leibniz joked that he was the soul, you know, you have the Solon of Athens, who created all of the what is considered the root, the birth of Western democracy in ancient Greece. Well, Leibniz joked that he was the Solon of Russia, because Peter the Great gave him the go-ahead to basically reform the legislature and also reform the sciences and so forth. So even though Leibniz was German at birth, he was one of the major influencers of what shaped later on American philosophy. That is the concept of creative industry in the arts and sciences as a foundation of economy based on freedom and liberty. So these are not separated concepts. Though Benjamin Franklin and Leibniz never met, because Leibniz passed away 1716 and Benjamin Franklin was born 1706 and lived to 1790, Franklin was incredibly influenced by Leibniz's works, who was also a scientist. Defining a scientist as not a compartmentalized thing, what was Leibniz was working on, but rather science as a culture, which he also laid out ironworks and manufacturing in Russia, and also resource development. He also played a role in Peter the Great, starting the first Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg in 1724. So, I'm not going to go too much into Benjamin Franklin because, I mean, Matt has done a lot of classes which are up on Rising Tide, and many people know at least elements of Benjamin Franklin. But on February 3rd, 1781, when Benjamin Franklin was stationed in Paris, France, Russian Princess Ekaterina Romanova-Dashkova was doing a European tour, and Benjamin Franklin made the point to visit her. She was 37 at the time, Franklin was 75. I'm going to go into Dashkova's background a bit more, because she's a truly fascinating person. So at the time, Franklin was serving diplomatically in France for the cause of American independence, because in 1781, America still didn't have its independence. It would only be until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So about 8 years later, Benjamin Franklin would be recruited as the first American member into the Russian Academy of Sciences, to which Dashkova was the director of. And Dashkova in turn would be the first woman and Russian, I believe the first Russian as well, to be admitted into Franklin's American Philosophical Society. So this was not just, you know, for show or, you know, some extra badge to put on your outfit, but this was really an agreement for an intelligence exchange for Republican ideas. And I will back that up as I go into a little bit more of Dashkova's life. So Dashkova, at an early age, it's too bad George's daughter wasn't here. As a teenager, she had already amassed a library of 900 books and had learned 5 languages. And at 19, she dressed in an officer's uniform and played an important role, arguably the leading role, in the coup d'etat that allowed Catherine the Great to take the throne from her husband. So Dashkova played a leading strategic role in that success. In 1782, she was appointed the director of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, which is a picture of it right here. She was the first woman in the world to lead a learned society. And Dashkova had succeeded in transitioning the Academy of Sciences from an adornment of the court to a scientific contributor to Russia. So at the time, like I was saying, there wasn't really a sciences, so to speak, back then, was that the scientists in those days were considered ornaments of royalty. So you were basically just supposed to get published in other countries to show off. It's like show-off pieces, but there wasn't really a concept of what you could do to uplift your own people or to uplift anything, right? They were just, you know, entertaining ideas. So at the time when Dashkova took over the academy, it was in bankruptcy. There was a very corrupt person before her, but she not only got it out of bankruptcy, but was able to create a career scientist rather than an ornament to the crown, where they could actually focus on things that could be implemented within Russia. And she actually made a bit of a folk story. I don't know if it's actually true, but just like the story of how the Irish saved civilization during the medieval times, she was saying that it was really Russia, the Slavic people, who also played a role like this, and that's why they've always been scientists, because they were able to save a lot of these great works when Europe was going through a dark age. So, what else did I want to say? So she also had started, it's going to get confusing because their names are very similar, but she started a Russian Academy of Language as well to study the Russian language, literature, and culture, which sounds like not that amazing, but the importance of this is that language was still developing, and the Russian language in particular was still developing in the communication of ideas. And in order to be a good scientist, you need to have the words to communicate ideas that have not existed before. So it's actually quite at the forefront, and Leibniz also was constantly having to create his own words to explain thought concepts that there were no words for. So Dashkova actually took up a project to create a dictionary that was incredibly influential in also dealing with words of morality, politics, and government that didn't exist before. And it was praised by the poet Pushkin, so that's a pretty high-level person to have praise from. Is there anything else I want to take a note of here? So, yeah, her directorship ended in 1793, right? So here is where there's no clear indication that Dashkova was a Republican in her ideology, but she was very close to Catherine the Great, and they became further and further apart. And then near the end of her life, there were two controversies that point to the fact that she probably was moving towards further Republican ideas, and this is how she was shaping these two very influential academies, basically think tanks, you can think of them, right? Leading think tanks. And so there was this play called Vadim of Novgorod by Nyazin, and it was really controversial because it thought it had, Catherine the Great and many others thought it had Republican sympathies, and the French Revolution just happened, so a bunch, Marie Antoinette, she got her head chopped off, a whole bunch of people got their head chopped off, and Catherine the Great was worried that this was to, increase that kind of sentiment. And on top of it, Dashkova's closest brother, who also had a position at the Imperial Academy of Sciences, his protege, had written one of the most influential books in Russian history called The Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. People related to Uncle Tom's Cabin in the sense that it was highly critical of the slave system, the serf system in Russia. And so with these two things, Dashkova had to resign from her post. And so I think that with her relationship with Benjamin Franklin and how she was shaping these two academies, I think that it very much was moving towards this Republican idea. So we'll say a little bit of Franklin's American Philosophical Society and what it meant to be a member, because not just anybody was admitted membership into this. Alexander von Humboldt, who was one of the greatest German scientists of the time, was a member of the American Philosophical Society. And he says a great quote. Do you want to read it, Matt?
Yeah. In considering the study of physical phenomena, not merely in its bearings on the material wants of life, but in its general influence on the intellectual advancement of mankind, we find its noblest and most important result to be a knowledge of the chain of connection by which all natural forces are linked together and made mutually dependent upon each other. And it is the perception of these relations that exalts our view and ennobles our enjoyments.
So, I know that's a mouthful, but it's okay. It's a repeating theme, so it'll become more clear. Humboldt recognized, as did Benjamin Franklin, that the sciences and economy are two sides of the same coin. The human mind and what we do to support ourselves is the domain of the scientist and the statesman alike. There's no separation from natural sciences or physics and moral science, and it all came together under political economy. Humboldt resurrected the use of the word cosmos from ancient Greek and assigned it to his multi-volume treatise called Cosmos, in which he sought to unify diverse branches of scientific knowledge and culture. This important work also motivated a holistic perception of the universe as one interacting entity. Again, this whole concept of open system. And man's role in this system as its highest expression so far. Vernadsky, who was the later director of the Russian Academy of Sciences in the 20th century, also studied Alexander von Humboldt. So again, this communication constantly happening between the Americans and the Russians. And he also, this idea of infrastructure and progress as a part of nature, that progress exists in nature, but that mankind makes it subject to willful self-development. This in turn influenced Vernadsky's conceptualization of the noosphere, which is the domain of nature shaped by human thought. This is a picture of the American Philosophical Society. I'm not going to talk too much about it, just the point being that this society, you know, when you say philosophy today, you never think of like philosophy that actually affects anything in your world. You're just talking about stuff and you don't even need to prove that what you're talking about actually is a good idea or is true. In Benjamin Franklin's Philosophical Society, there's no such thing. There's no ivory tower academia and abstract philosophy that would benefit no one, but you know, give you possibly a fancy title. But rather it was focused on philosophy that could put ideas into practice. This involved all domains, so there is many scientists within this philosophical society and statesmen, but it especially focused on political economy. Benjamin Franklin's discovery of electricity was representative of the expected standard for contribution towards society within this society. So we'll skip ahead. Gilpin, who's both his grandfather and his father and his uncle, whoa, what's going on? Were members of the American Philosophical Society. And Gilpin is one of the first, if not the first, to talk about the World Land Bridge. So I don't know if you see, no, you don't see the bottom of it. So the whole title of the map is supposed to say Gilpin's American Economic Just and Correct Map of the World. So Gilpin was very influenced by Alexander von Humboldt's Cosmos, which he took with him in all his travels. And in 1846, William Gilpin was voted head to the committee of in Missouri to draft the resolutions for the Transcontinental Railway. And his idea was always that this transcontinental railway would be a gateway to China. Someone want to read a quote from Gilpin where he explains his thoughts on this? All right, I'll read it.
Let it be
Mark, I
resolved.
can do it.
Let it be resolved that whereas the Almighty has placed the territories of the American Union in the center between Asia and Europe, and the route of the Asiatic and European railway through the heart of our nation domain, it is our duty to the human family to prosecute vigorously through its new channel that supreme commerce between the Oriental nations and the nations of the Atlantic, which history proves to have existed in all ages, and to be necessary to keep alive community, science and civilization among mankind.
A lot of ideas for what seems to be such a simple line going from point A to point B. Another amazing thing is that a lot of this had to be implemented during the Civil War, one of the most expensive wars in history, and violent. So some may snidely remark that Gilpin's affinity for China was mere pragmatism based purely upon economic or geopolitical advantage over the British. However, in 1852, a testimony by German scientist Julius Firewall tells a different story. Firewall, again a student of Alexander von Humboldt, also editor of the Swiss Republican newspaper, spent several months with Gilpin in Independence, Missouri, and his accounts expressed a much higher level of understanding of the paradigm which united China and America under one mandate of heaven, through whose submission alone America could find salvation from the corrupting effects of European influence. So Julius Firewall says, sorry, it's not very clear, this culture, he, Gilpin, admits, has become degenerate in America itself, but in China it is still found in a pure state. Hence, salvation must come to America from China. Interesting. And this consists in the introduction of the Chinese Constitution vis-a-vis the patriarchal democracy of the Celestial Empire. The political life of the United States is through European influences in a state of complete demoralization. So at this time, slavery, the southern plantations were at their peak. And the Chinese Constitution alone contains elements of regeneration. For this reason, a railroad to the Pacific is of such vast importance, since by its means the Chinese trade will be conducted straight across the North American continent. This trade must bring in its train Chinese civilization, and that is usually alleged against China. All that is usually alleged against China is mere calumny spread purposefully, just like those calumnies which are circulated in Europe about the United States. So a lot of people, they think that the United States is all about colonizing other places. Interesting that one of the leaders in the thought process and the development of the transcontinental rail was saying we need to do this to save ourselves, and China is going to save us. So just to compare, this is a map of the British Empire around the same time, and it's not based on a rail system, right, as you see here. Obviously this is a much more simplistic version, but it's rather based off of naval dominance. So it's very easy for the British Empire to keep control as long as there wasn't rail built. And the red sections are either areas where they had their commonwealths or where they had their slave power colonies existing. So, describing the grand design for international public works, Gilpin would write the 1890 magnum opus called the Cosmopolitan Railway. And he states, Railways continue to extend themselves, soon to become a universal system over all the lands of the globe. We have seen the energies of the American people bringing into line and into use these new powers, span their continent with the Pacific railways as with the rapidity of lightning from a mountain cloud, availing themselves of the favorable thermal warmth upon the plateau and upon the immediate sea coasts. Bathed by the Asiatic Gulf Stream, they will continue to expand their work to Bering Straits, where all the continents are united. This will extend itself along similarly propitious thermal selvage of the oriental Russian coasts into China. He's using terminology from Alexander von Humboldt. To prolong this unbroken line of cosmopolitan railways along the latitudinal plateau of Asia to Moscow and to London will not have long delay. The less significant and isolated continents of the southern hemisphere, South America, Africa, and Australasia, will be reached by feeders through Panama, Suez, and the chain of oriental peninsulas and islands. The whole area and all the populations of the globe will thus be united and fused by land travel and railway. So this is a picture of Cassius Marcellus Clay, which unfortunately has been quite overshadowed by the naming of Muhammad Ali's original name. They're not related, but there is a connection in the sense that Muhammad Ali's father, I think, went to this college that I'm going to talk about and was named after Cassius Clay, which he passed down to his son. So in 1845, Cassius Marcellus Clay of Lexington, Kentucky, proclaimed himself the first to ever beard the monster in his den when he founded True American, an anti-slavery newspaper. He was the son of a prominent Southern plantation owner. However, he heard Garrison's speeches and he immediately freed his slaves, and then a year later he set up this anti-slavery paper.
This is William Lloyd Garrison?
Yeah. So a realist, he fireproofed his print shop that was printing this anti-slavery paper since it wasn't popular with a lot of people. He fireproofed it with iron, positioned 2 cannons at the door, and hung rifles on the wall. He's quite a character. He's very, and as you'll see, he got along with the Russians really well. Clay's hubris so inflamed the neighbors that while he was sick at home, only then did the mob dare to empty the premises. Clay moved his printing operation to Cincinnati, continuing to edit at his Lexington office. After giving a speech in Texas denouncing slavery in 1849, he single-handedly fought off 6 attackers.
Wow.
Clay's,
like 6'3" or something.
you haven't even heard it yet.
Get him by the door.
Clay's fiery opposition to slavery would come to encompass the system's impact on whites as well. Slavery, he vehemently argued, hurt the South and its white workers. The North was radiant with railroads, the channels of her untold commerce, whilst the South hobbles on at immeasurable distance behind. Instead of retreating into wealth and the privileged life of a Southern planter, Clay campaigned ardently against slavery, decrying its harm to blacks and to poor whites. In 1899, in Kentucky, the Berea College, which you see a picture of here, student body was visibly more racially diverse than its counterparts around the nation. And this was because they were very influenced by Cassius Marcellus Clay, who was born in Kentucky and shaped the thoughts of the people there. It was also one of the few colleges, I think, to admit women students as well. In 1912, the tuition-free institution reached out to needy students across Appalachia, a gesture recalling Clay's antebellum interest in educating poor whites. Berea's motto, the name of the college, remains, "God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth." So after organizing, he actually, because when Lincoln was first inaugurated, his life was on the line. You know, there was a whole plot to kill him, and they had to have someone acting as Lincoln, and they raided the carriage, and they found out that Lincoln was already at the White House. Cassius Marcellus Clay also got wind of this, and he organized a battalion to defend the White House. So they made sure that nobody would storm the White House during this transition period.
Also, just so you know, William Gilpin was one of Lincoln's bodyguards.
Right, William Gilpin was also one of Lincoln's bodyguards when he had to get into Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated. So there's a quote from Cassius: "It is an evil to the free laborer by forcing him by the laws of competition, supply and demand to work for the wages of the slave, food and shelter. The competition of unrequited service, slave labor, dooms the laboring white millions of these states to poverty. Poverty gives them over to ignorance, and ignorance and poverty are the fast high roads to crime and suffering." So again, as Martin Luther King recognized, the slavery system was not just against the black slaves, but it was to take away the humanity of everyone, and it was to also keep white people in poverty. In 1861, so this is all the same year when Lincoln had to get into Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated, and he organized this battalion. That same year, as the story goes, Cassius Clay was too volatile, bombastic of a person to lead a regiment, according to Lincoln. I don't know why he had those thoughts. So Lincoln suggested that he become the ambassador to Spain, and Cassius Clay was like, how about ambassador to Russia? And so he started his historical position as ambassador to Russia. He's probably the greatest U ambassador to Russia that has ever held that position, which he held in 1861 to 62 and then 63 to 69. So he quickly made steadfasting relations. They say, because Tsar Alexander II, he freed his serfs that year, they say that Cassius Clay actually played a role in, obviously Tsar Alexander II was thinking of doing this already, but that Cassius got the ball rolling, and that year that he went into Russia, Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs, which were 23 million in number.
Wow, 23 million.
Yeah. He also became good friends with the Dashkova family, which he frequently cited in his memoirs, another indication that the Dashkova family are Republicans. Clay was also going to play as the key negotiator for the Alaska purchase with Seward, which I'll go through in more detail later. So in 1861, the Emancipation Edict was passed and successfully carried out by Tsar Alexander II, which would free 23 million serfs. This was by no means a simple task, for there was much resistance met and required an amazing degree of statesmanship on the part of Tsar Alexander II. And here's a quote that he said to the marshals of nobility in 1856, so 5 years before he would do this. He states, "You can yourself understand that the present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below, as in a rebellion or a revolution. I ask you to think about the best way to carry this out." So he's giving them time. You know, it's a lot to think about, 23 million serfs to be freed, but it's going to happen. Do I have any more notes here? The success of this edict would go down in history as one of the greatest accomplishments for human freedom, and Tsar Alexander II would become known as the Great Liberator, for which he was beloved around the world, though we don't hear about those sorts of things today. Shortly after, in 1863, President Lincoln would pass the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. There is astonishingly a great deal of cynicism around this today. It is thought that because Lincoln did not announce this at the beginning of the war, it somehow was never genuine. The preservation of the country was to be the utmost priority, since you needed the effort of a country to end slavery. Lincoln was willing to see out the end of slavery over a longer period if it could have meant avoiding the Civil War, which again, he was the most violent and costly war, I think, at that time. When it became clear that this was not possible and all-out war was inevitable, he declared that slavery would be abolished in the Confederate-held states upon the Union's victory. So here is just a speech he gave 7 years before he would become president, just to give an indication of how he was talking. He didn't even have the idea of running for president in mind at this time. This declared indifference by, as I must think, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men among ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principle of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. I actually just did a class not too long ago on Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, which goes on this subject further. If there are people who are stubborn that it never was meant, the Civil War was never fought to end slavery. So as an I haven't talked about the British yet, but the British are really the reason why the Civil War, why it reached a situation where the United States was ready to tear itself into, not just even two, but into pieces. It probably wouldn't have been two parts, it would have been pieces. And there's a very interesting quote by Lord Robert Cecil, who was a member of Parliament at the time. He would later become Marquess of Salisbury, which is a very distinguished title in Britain, and he would be the British Prime Minister 3 times. So we should take note to what he says. During the Civil War, he states, "The northern states of America never can be our sure friends because we are rivals. Rivals politically, rivals commercially. With the southern states, the case is entirely reversed. The population are an agricultural people. They furnish the raw materials of our industry, and they consume the products which we manufacture from it. With them, every interest must lead us to cultivate friendly relations, and when the war began, they at once recurred to England as their natural ally." Sounds a bit like a colony. So this is a map. When I showed that map of the British Empire zones, the southern part of the United States wasn't included, but the fact is, and again, I did a class that goes more over the history of how slavery was introduced into Britain and, into US, and that it was completely from Britain, especially from the Royal Africa Company. But all to say that there was a fight, and slavery was being abolished in the United States until Thomas Jefferson's presidency, the assassination of Alexander Hamilton, and then it kind of all went down. And the South became more and more dominated by free trade policies and slavery, which go hand in hand, by the way. So here's a map just to show that the southern cotton plantations would then be shipped. It was 75% of this would be shipped to Britain, and Britain also treated its own people awful. I think we've all seen the working conditions during this time. Charles Dickens has also written about the horrors of the treatment of even children in these workhouses. So it's not a color thing. As poor white people in the South too are suffering from this type of economy. So it would be shipped to Britain. Britain conveniently destroyed the textile industry in India, and replaced India as an world opium producer, which they then pushed on the Chinese with 2 opium wars. So by 1840, cotton made up more than half of American exports. However, the North, they were still following the Alexander Hamilton machine tool industry, which again Frederick Douglass, a former slave, remarks when he escapes from the South and he first enters the North. He's like, my God, you do things so much more cheaply and efficiently here. So this is really what was at head, was that there were two economic systems at that point that were going to have a war for who would dominate. And you can see that the British Empire had invested interest in the South succeeding in this. And again, this idea of free trade, that China didn't have a right to refuse opium, because if there was a demand for it, then it was Britain's right to sell opium to China. In autumn of 1862, this would be the first critical phase of the war, and there was talk that Britain and France were thinking of intervening and actually physically, militarily backing up the Confederate states. So Lincoln sent an urgent letter to Russian Foreign Minister Gorchakov informing him of this, and the Foreign Minister, Gorchakov, wrote in response, "You know that the government of the United States has few friends among the powers. England rejoices over what is happening to you. She longs and prays for your overthrow. France is less actively hostile. Her interests would be less affected by the result, but she is not unwilling to see it. She is not your friend. Your situation is getting worse and worse. The chances of preserving the Union are growing more desperate. Can nothing be done to stop this dreadful war? The hope of reunion is growing less and less, and I wish to impress upon your government that the separation, which I fear must come, will be considered by Russia as one of the greatest misfortunes. Russia alone has stood by you from the first, and will continue to stand by you. We are very, very anxious that some means should be adopted, that any course should be pursued which will prevent the division which now seems inevitable. One separation will be followed by another. You will break into fragments." So President Lincoln was then given the go-ahead to publicize Russia's support, and this held off Britain and France's attack. However, there would be a second critical phase in the war during the summer of 1863. By then, the South's invasion of the North had failed at Gettysburg, and the violent anti-war New York draft riots also failed. Britain was once again thinking of direct military intervention into the war. What would follow marks one of the greatest displays of support for another country's sovereignty to ever occur in modern history. The Russian Navy arrived on both the east and west coastlines of the United States late September and early October 1863. The timing was highly coordinated due to intelligence reports of when Britain and France were intending their military action. The Russian Navy would stay along the U.S. coastline in support of the Union for 7 months. They never intervened in the American Civil War, but rather remained in its waters at the behest of Lincoln in the case of a foreign power's interference. And if you note, so this is a copy of the Naval Historical Foundation. They have a lot of information on this, but it's getting harder and harder on a Google search to get this information. At the bottom of the picture, it states the Russian Squadron in New York, 1863. So, if you guys have any questions, by the way, feel free to say something. So during the 7 months of the Russian Navy, there were celebrations amongst the Civil War. And this is a drawing of one of the parades that occurred through New York. Because the American people were very clear that the Russians had saved them from Britain, because back then it was still, recognized that Britain was no friend to the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, which was always in opposition to the rule of kings. And again, if anyone wants more information, you can visit the Navy Department Library. They have a nice collection of things. So Tsar Alexander II, who held sole power to declare war for Russia, stated in an interview to the American banker Wharton Barker on August 17, 1879, which was later published in The Independent, March 24, 1904, his reason for why he sent the Navy to defend Lincoln's Union. Which, by the way, they had their own problems. You know, it wasn't like they had, you know, a whole bunch of extra Navy to send to different parts of the world. In the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain proposed to Russia, in a formal but not in an official way, the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, quote, "I will not cooperate with such action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love of my own dear Russia, rather than for love of the American Republic. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic with advanced industrial development were broken up, and Great Britain should be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. An official recognition that Great Britain represented slave power, colonial dominance, and that the American concept represented sovereignty." What was Tsar Alexander II referring to exactly when mentioning the advanced industrial development of the American Republic? Well, in short, he was referring to the Hamiltonian system of economics. Notably, Alexander Hamilton's 1791 report on the usefulness of the manufactories in relation to trade and agriculture, which was published in St. Petersburg in 1807, sponsored by Russian Minister of Finance D.A. Guriev, had in its introduction this to say of Hamilton's works: "The similarity of American United Provinces with Russia appears both in the expanse of the land, climate, and natural conditions, in the size of population disproportionate to the space, and in the general youthfulness of various generally useful institutions. Therefore, all the rules, remarks, and means proposed here are suitable for our country." So, just to go through a bit of an overview of like how was this being shaped in Russia, this concept of the American system. In 1842, Tsar Nicholas I hired American George Washington Whistler to oversee the building of the St. Petersburg-Moscow, do I have the right map here? Yes, I do. St. Petersburg to Moscow Railway, Russia's first large-scale railroad. In 1860s, Henry C. Carey's economics, who was the leading advisor of Lincoln's presidency, would be promoted in the St. Petersburg University education system, which was organized by none other than Cassius Clay. Carey was a leading economic advisor, right, and he was the leading Hamiltonian of his age. We'll talk a little bit more of him later. Sergei Witte was the Russian Minister of Finance from 1889 to 91, and later became Prime Minister in 1905 of Russia, would publish in 1889 the incredibly influential paper titled National Savings and Friedrich List, which resulted in a new customs law for Russia. Friedrich List, again, was very much influenced by Hamilton. He wrote this, he made it clear. This new customs law for Russia in 1891 resulted in an exponential growth increase in Russia's economy. Lincoln's Pacific Railroad Superintendent, General Grenville Dodge, advised Russia on its Trans-Siberian Railroad built with Pennsylvania steel and locomotives from 1890 to 1905. There's a joke later on when the Chinese were also starting to adopt these policies that the British sent the Chinese opium and the Americans sent them Pennsylvania steel locomotives. Very much likened to what China is doing today with these projects. You see what the IMF and the World Bank are doing, and then you see what the Chinese are doing, and it's like night and day. So in 1890, in his budget report, Sergei Witte, echoing the Belt and Road Initiative unfolding today, wrote, "The railroad is like a leaven, which creates a cultural fermentation among the population. Even if it passed through an absolutely wild people along its way, it would raise them in a short time to the level requisite for its operation." Sergei Witte was explicit of his following of the American model of political economy when he described his reorganization of the Russian railways, saying, "Faced by a serious shortage of locomotives, I invented and applied in the traffic system, which had long been in practice in the United States, and which is now known as the American system."
Small gap.
Yeah, while the British Empire was busy creating wars across the world, with the Crimean War with the Russians, the Opium War with the Chinese, and the suppression of the vast Indian uprisings, which we will have a class on in about 2 weeks' time, the power alliance between Russia and America was still the worst nightmare of the British Empire. And so just to get people to understand that the Bering Strait connection is a 150-year idea, which was very much formulated during the lifetimes of Lincoln and Alexander II, which was, again, as I was saying, it's going to solidify this common view of economy for not just their own countries, but it would ultimately be a decision for the world that would no longer be led under a system of empire. So Stoichkov, who is the Russian ambassador to the US, was one of the leading instrumental figures for the Alaska Purchase, which was absolutely imperative if the Bering Strait were to take off. And he got the go-ahead when he went back to Russia by all the important people. And I don't need to, I think, read this quote because it just really solidifies further what we've already heard, which is that it is in Russia's best interest that the United States prosper and that they're linked together with this idea of economy. So it was pushed through. As soon as Stoichkov arrived and he talked to Seward on the evening of March 29th, 1867, he said, yeah, so Russia gave the go-ahead for you to buy Alaska, so yeah, we can meet tomorrow. And Seward's like, we're going to work on this right now. And they worked throughout the whole night and they got it done. And, these people, what I call what do you call them? Professional breadwinner historians, the kind of people who care more about their money and their title and they rewrite history.
Bread scholars.
They call Seward, that the Alaska Purchase was the folly of Seward, but actually it was one of the most important things that has ever occurred in history, world history, for diplomacy, world diplomacy, because the Bering Strait was to link the world. And it's really a travesty. These historians are either very ignorant or they're despicable for saying this about Seward. And Seward himself said that this was the most important thing he ever did in his life. So, Britain.
That's really something. And this is the guy who helped Lincoln save the Union from collapsing in the Civil War.
Yeah.
He's saying that the Alaska Purchase is the most important thing he's ever done in his life.
But it is one of the most important purchases in history.
Yeah.
Period. Because if the United States didn't have Alaska, and it's under British rule, there's no way in hell Russia's going to connect to Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank God
Just
it's
look at this
the
map.
US, under the US Constitution.
So basically looking down.
Yeah.
From the very
So,
north, circle is all just one big.
Britain knew that it had still a playing hand. I mean, this is the thing. They joke about Alaska because Alaska today is not developed and it was never linked up as it should be. So these are people who, you know, if people understood their history, they would recognize this as like you're talking about something that would have benefited the world and you're laughing at the fact that it never happened. Like, who do you work for?
And you're ignoring the arsonists who sabotaged it the whole time.
Yeah. So the Britain recognized that British Columbia was going to be the essential component. So British Columbia was the missing link in this. I'm sorry, my friends. I've lived here too. And so they understood that if British Columbia were to get joined up in this, it was over for the naval power of the British Empire. Oops. And and at the time too, like British Columbia, they're very isolated from England and they're getting nothing. They're actually bankrupt colony. And the United States, despite there being a civil war, they're in a better off place, if you can imagine, the North economically. And British Columbia was very much thinking of joining up with California.
Absolutely.
There was a bit of a mischance. Matt wrote about this. Actually, there was a real mischance. And obviously, if you look into further the history of the United States, which is constantly a civil war, you know, it's never been just like the official civil war periods, but there's always been an opposition of a continuation of empire versus what actually was the basis of the Declaration of Independence. But in 1872, there was the Alabama Claims, where the British were found guilty in the first international court trial of intervening in the Civil War. Illegally, okay? It was illegal to do this. And so Britain was caught in a bit of a vulnerable position, and they're like, what do you want? And so there was some, you know, I don't know the details of these people, but they obviously, Seward and Sumner were asking for basically British Columbia because they wanted their vision.
They wanted all of
fulfilled.
Canada for
They wanted all,
$2 billion.
Maybe they shouldn't have said that. Maybe they should have just said British Columbia, but even then they probably would not have got it. But instead, embarrassingly, these Americans, I don't know if they're real Americans, they settled for $15 million that was not even going to be paid until like 10 years later. So they completely missed out on this opportunity to claim British Columbia. Tsar Nicholas II, he's a mixed bag. However, to his credit, he wanted to continue the Trans-Siberian Rail, which was completed in 1905 through the Bering Strait connection. And you know, there's a quote from the New York Times talking about how he was like, you know, completely serious about this. There were $250 to $300 million involved, and they were encouraging Russia, France, and the United States to take bonds. France is always a bit of a mixed bag. It's sometimes with Britain, it's sometimes not with Britain. So in 1876, Henry C. Carey organized the Centennial Exhibition, which is a really big deal, and like a lot of people don't talk about it enough, but there were 10 million people who came to this from around the world, from 37 countries, to Philadelphia to see the achievements of the United States that despite the Civil War occurring, despite Lincoln being assassinated, 10 years later, following Henry C. Carey's economics, which he continued to live on, the United States was undoubtedly the leader in economy. But not only that, they wanted to share how they did it with the world. 3 years later, Otto von Bismarck broke from, which is a picture that you see here, he broke from Germany's free trade system, the British system, implementing an American-style tariff policy for Germany. The kinship between Germany and the United States became so strong at this time that Otto von Bismarck's speech in the German parliament, which I'll read shortly, was also repeated by he wasn't president at the time, McKinley, on the floor of the US Congress. So he says, "A success of the United States in material development is the most illustrious of modern time. The American nation has not only successfully borne and suppressed the most gigantic and expensive war of all history," which is quite something considering you had like the 100 Years' War in Europe, "but immediately afterward disbanded its army, found employment for all its soldiers and marines, paid off most of its debt, given labor and homes to all the unemployed in Europe as fast as they could arrive within its territory, and still by a system of taxation so indirect as not to be perceived, much less felt. Because it is my deliberate judgment that the prosperity of America is mainly due to its protective laws, I urge that Germany has now reached that point where it is necessary to imitate the tariff system of the United States." So now we have Russia and we have Germany. So Otto von Bismarck would propose the Berlin to Baghdad rail, which, if this had been a success when Otto von Bismarck proposed it, it was completed much later. It was completed in 1940. Okay, Otto von Bismarck died in around the 1890s, so there was a real delay on this. The Sykes-Picot disaster would never have occurred. The whole carving up of the Middle East, the shit show that we see in the Middle East, would never have been if the Berlin to Baghdad rail had occurred.
The Ottoman Empire might not have collapsed and might have performed as well and modernized at that time.
Very good point.
Yes.
Very good point.
You want to give this class? No. You could totally give this class. You could totally give this class.
Sorry.
I'm using a lot of his words.
Thanks.
Anyway, all right. So Henry C. Carey. So this system, it's spreading through the world. I'm going to go through some other countries that were adopting the American system. And again, it was never meant as like an American dominant system. It was a system for everyone. And Henry C. Carey talks about this in an explicit way of what was this vision for the world in his Harmony of Interest in 1851. You want to read it, Matt?
I vote for Kurt or Ken or John.
My eyesight's not so good.
I vote for Kurt or Donna.
Right from the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages, and to the owner of capital goods profits. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud of to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world.
So I think at this point it's becoming very clear the British Empire free trade policy versus the Leibniz, Alexander von Humboldt, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Henry C. Carey's idea of economy that was uniquely something that the United States put forth into the world in opposition to empire. There really was not a competent form to combat empire before this. This is very big, and we shouldn't, despite our dislike of what the United States has become today, we shouldn't wash over that. It's important because it's based on a universal principle. It's based on a concept of truthful basis for economic development. And we risk that we lose that, and then we make ourselves more vulnerable to systems of empire, to systems of oligarchy, by thinking that everything that came from the United States we should hate today. So America's Civil War was actually a contest for the whole world. There's two systems battling within one country, but it was a vision for the whole world. And Lincoln's nationalist supporters carried their revolution abroad to Germany, Russia, Ireland, Japan with the Meiji Restoration, China with Sun Yat-sen, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and other nations. Unfortunately, a lot of those were not fully developed because of sabotage. Anton Chaikin, he's gone through a lot of this in more detail, which I won't go through right now. In terms of Japan, I'm not going to say too much. Just the Meiji Restoration, which was incredibly important to Japan, was directly from Henry C. Carey Networks, and it was Britain's disorganizing of Japan. A lot of people got disorganized for World War I and World War II to occur, which was again to split what was the spread of the American system. These world wars were basically to get people concentrated again on local affairs, local drama, and they lost sight of the bigger vision. So here's a picture of Sun Yat-sen's 3 Principles of the People, very much influenced by Lincoln, and Friedrich List, who was very much influenced by Hamilton. So we're close to the end. I just wanted to mention McKinley's tariff of 1890. This was a big deal. McKinley was kind of, in some ways, the last stand before the FDR fight that Matt's going to go over. McKinley was the last president to have fought in the Civil War. He enhanced trade with the countries of South America and Mexico and maintained common protection against Britain's free trade policies. So protectionism, we have to put it into context. It was protection against the British Empire's free trade, specifically. And this effectively shut out, the McKinley tariff effectively shut out Britain from the entirety of the West Indies and South America. So obviously this guy had to go, right? So there's a quote from him. He said, "Free trade may be suitable to Great Britain and its peculiar social and political structure, but it has no place in this republic, where classes are unknown and where caste has long since been banished, where equality is a rule, where labor is dignified and honorable, where education and improvement are the individual striving of every citizen, no matter what may be the accident of his birth or the poverty of his early surroundings. Here, the mechanic of today is the manufacturer of a few years hence. Under such conditions, free trade can have no abiding place here." And this is,
Here.
he said this as a rebuke on free trade in the House of Representatives in 1882. So here are just a list of assassinations. I know I'm ending on a bit of a, but it's because people say like, oh, well, if the United States was so great, why isn't the world a better place, right? Kind of like how what Voltaire did to Leibniz with Candide. It's like, oh, the world is such an awful place. Like, why are we going to say that the potential of mankind is something good? Well, these are not natural phenomenons necessarily when good things don't work out. Sometimes they're sabotaged. So President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, 4 weeks after his inauguration. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated 1881. President Garfield was assassinated 1881. Otto von Bismarck was ousted by 1890. President of France, Sadi Carnot, assassinated 1894, also Republican. Tsar Alexander III poisoned 1894. President McKinley assassinated 1901. You're going to notice there's a lot of Americans and Russians specifically in this list. Vyacheslav von Plehve, I'm sorry if I pronounced that badly, Russian Minister of the Interior, assassinated 1904. He was working closely with Sergei Witte on economic projects. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, assassinated 1905, also the same. Russia Minister of Interior, Pyotr Stolypin, Prime Minister from 1906 to 1911, assassinated 1911. They're all working on what Sergei Witte had branched off of. Tsar Nicholas II, who called for the Bering Strait, assassinated 1918. President of China, Sun Yat-sen, forced to step down after less than 1 year. Even though China loves him, he was forced to step down from January, he only had his presidency from January 1st to March 10th, 1912. Now the Chinese don't like to talk about this too much, but that was definitely from foreign intervention. That was not a natural, they like to romanticize it, like, oh, he obviously this means he didn't care about power and blah, blah, blah. Why become the president, right? So, to end with this note, but with the follow-up of Matt, who is the optimist of us two, and the optimist of also this conference. No, he's converted me to optimism, don't worry. That was not so, Lincoln's statue, which if anyone has not visited Washington, D.C., despite all of the disgustingness of Washington, D.C., there's also a lot of beauty in it. The Capitol Hill is actually a very beautiful, beautiful building. On top of Lincoln's statue, it says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people, for whom he saved the Union." That is all of America, not just the North. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. And we'll end here on a quote by President Lincoln when he was in a debate before he became president. In 1858, he was debating the slave powers champion Stephen Douglas for the presidency, and he said, "That is the issue that will continue into this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. That is, when we no longer shall be. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings." We'll leave it at that.
Great way to end.